programs and any reforms that are necessary. And that's just some commentary rather than ask you for a response. But I'll yield back to Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you to the ranking member. Mr. Secretary, was our democracy attacked this past election?
Yes.
By who?
The Russian government.
And it sounds like, based on your experience, this attack that occurred could have easily been carried out not just by Russia, but by other foreign adversaries. Is that right?
Yes. There are certain nation-state actors, several, that have those kinds of capabilities.
And it also could have been carried out by non-nation-state actors like terrorist groups. Is that right?
The level of sophistication that we saw last year, I'm not sure the terrorist organizations that I'm familiar with would have that level of sophistication and capability, but it's an emerging threat.
And certainly by cyber criminals?
Yes.
And you've described that the cost of this attack is the chaos that we find ourselves here today, that we're holding hearings, and as you described, we're not working on issues like health care.
The people's business, correct. Yeah. I think that's one of them, yes.
And would you agree that the first step to solving a problem, have you heard of this quote or this idea, is to acknowledge that a problem exists?
Sure, yes.
Why do you think that President Trump will not state that Russia meddled in our elections?
You'd have to ask him, sir.
Mr. Secretary,
I've seen various different statements from him on this topic.
Does that concern you?
Well, I think that a president, a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of Homeland Security, a Secretary of State depends upon the intelligence community. And otherwise, if you don't, you can't effectively do your job. You're flying blind. Your intelligence community is what are your eyes and ears to do your job.
Now, Mr. Secretary, you've talked about what we need to do going forward, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this committee, as Mr. Gowdy referenced, one of our duties is to get to the bottom of whether any U.S. persons worked with Russia, and then it's the FBI and Department of Justice's job, if they did, to hold them accountable. But I think we all agree that if we are back here in 2019 or 2021 after the midterm and the next presidential election talking about a new hack and a new meddling, we have failed the people that we represent. And you talked about in your statement that you came to the determination that election infrastructure should be designated as critical infrastructure subsector. Can you explain what this designation means legally and practically?
Essentially three things. One, it means that when the sector seeks our cybersecurity assistance, we prioritize providing it. That's number one. Number two, it means that the certain communications that we have with critical infrastructure are confidential and protected from public disclosure so as to avoid discussion about vulnerabilities. And number three, if you're critical infrastructure, you have the protection of the international cyber norm that says nation states should not attack critical infrastructure of other nation states.
Would you agree that conducting stress tests, as we now do post-2008 with our financial institutions, on voter information and voter balloting systems would be helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, in addition to structural reforms to our election systems, do you also agree that just a general, broader awareness would benefit the American people as far as social media trolls, fake news, the dissemination of hacked information, and how that can affect outcomes?
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, you said that in January you designated our election systems as critical infrastructure, and I want you to comment on a claim that candidate Trump made during the campaign season. He said, "Remember, we are competing in a rigged election to a Wisconsin rally. They want to try and rig the election at the polling booths, where so many cities are corrupt and voter fraud is all too common." Did you find that any polling booths were rigged?
Well, as I said, I know of no evidence that as a result of any cyber attack, ballots were altered or reporting was altered. That comment goes to cyber attacks. I cannot comment on the integrity of every voting machine in Chicago or San Francisco or South Carolina.
after the election, President-elect Trump said that 3 to 5 million people cast illegal votes. In your position as Homeland Security Secretary, did you find that that occurred?
I'm not in a position to comment on that. I heard the same claim. I'm just not in a position to comment on that.
And can you judge the credibility just based on your experience and interaction with James Comey? Do you find him to be a highly credible individual?
Yes.
Do you find John Brennan to be a highly credible individual?
Yes.
And Mr. Secretary, can you just talk a little bit about, you talked about the importance of a carrot rather than a stick with our local election systems, because I don't think any of us want to see a federal takeover, but we don't want to find ourselves in a position like this again. What could we walk away from today and tell our local election officials that we could do together to make sure that they're better prepared the next time Americans go to the polls?
The process is vulnerable to future cyber attacks by those who are becoming increasingly aggressive, ingenious, and capable. So that's number one. Number two, it's in everyone's interest at the local, state, and national level to ensure the cybersecurity integrity of the process, which is vulnerable and exposed in certain respects. We had the experience we had last year, and from that we have to learn. And if we do not grapple with this, we're failing as a democracy, and those of us in public office are failing the people we serve.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service, and wish